続けて人口減少の国際比較、アメリカ、ヨーロッパ、日本と題しまして、カンザス州立大学社会学部教授、ラースロー・クルチャー先生にご講演いただきます。クルチャー先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Well, can you hear me? Oh, excellent. Well, konnichiwa, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be here, and you allowed me to talk about depopulation in an international perspective. So the picture you see here is the geographic center of the United States. As you can see, there is plenty of empty lands around here to be populated. There's also a small ironic note. The table says Lebanon has souvenirs. Lebanon is a very small town close to the center of the US. It has no souvenirs at all. It's a completely depopulating town with no businesses whatsoever. So it's kind of like tells you the story of how difficult it is to find even something that each country has only one, the geographic center, and then utilize it for any good economic reason. All right, so let's talk about a little bit the demographic causes of depopulation. I'm going to rush through this because you've heard about this before, and I don't really want to create or recreate the wheel here. Well, the demographic causes could be shock events because of war or natural disasters. It could be fertility decline, as it was mentioned before, particularly if the total fertility rate falls below 2.1. And most importantly, it could be negative net migration, which even if there are places with higher than above replacement fertility, could still create depopulation. So we have to differentiate between the national and local impacts. At the national level, depopulation tends to be a combination of long-term fertility decline and negative outmigration and negative net migration. At the local level, depopulation usually comes from a structural changes in the economy that change sort of like the job situations and residential situations, or some shock event that establishes a new pattern. And I'm going to give an example for that in a minute. So the question we need to ask is whether demography is destiny. Why should we be concerned about depopulation that much? Of course, we have to be concerned about somewhat because it can come with economic recession. It can create really important cultural or psychological issues. Does our place, wither away? And the part of the world where I come from in Eastern Europe, that is a huge issue because we tend to have really small countries. And also the political impact, does this change the constituents? A change in age composition, for instance, could mean that people's voting behavior may change. So what are some of the outcomes? The most obvious is shrinking population size. If there is depopulation, you're going to have less people. This may not be a big problem if you could keep composition the same way. There's also aging, which you know all about, that tends to happen after age-selective outmigration. It does change age composition, and then it can undercut future growth potentials for a place. And also, the important thing is, particularly at the local level, these two usually come together. So you have a shrinking population size, and at the same time, you have aging, and that creates sort of like a vicious cycle of problems. Again, a really nice Kansas landscape. Again, plenty of empty land, so anybody really feels a strong urge to move there, be my guest. So we could start anywhere in this cycle, but let's start at the top. Top with population loss, right? So population loss means the loss of consumers. People are not buying things. If they are not buying things, it means a loss of businesses because businesses will not be able to sell things, which then turns to the loss of revenues because they don't pay taxes, so the local governments do not have monies. And the reaction to that would be the loss of services when they consolidate social services, particularly education and healthcare. And after that, some additional people may say, well, I don't really want my kid to be on the school bus for 3 hours a day, so I'm just going to move to someplace else. Once places get into this vicious cycle, it is extremely difficult to get out of that. So let's go international. I picked Bulgaria. Bulgaria is the poster child of depopulation, national level depopulation in Europe. As you could see, the total fertility rate has already gone below 2.1 in the 1980s, and it has been under that since then. Net migration, there wasn't a whole lot of migration during the communist period because Bulgaria was behind the Iron Curtain and people could not just leave the country even if they wanted to. But once Once we turn to a democracy, then suddenly people realize that there is life outside of Bulgaria and they decided to go to someplace else. If you add these two together, then this is obviously not very surprising to see population growth rates were going into the negative really strongly. This is a picture I took in Bulgaria when I was in fieldwork a couple of years ago. This used to be a supermarket. Now the only social function this building has is the posting of death notices on the windows, which is pretty sad. And it does tell you about how problematic things have become. Now, Germany. This is not a country that people usually talk about when they talk about depopulation. Its population has peaked in 2003 with about 82 million people. But the important thing in the German case is the huge difference between the western half of the country, you know, the former West Germany, and the eastern half, East Germany. So these two parts were separated during the communist era. They had completely different growth patterns and development strategies, and this is what you can see. A lot of migration dynamics are going on. People tend to leave the eastern part toward the western part. People tend to leave rural areas and move to cities. And no wonder that in the whole East German territories, Berlin is the only place that is actually growing. And of course, immigrants tend to move to specific places. So they don't move randomly around. They go to places of economic opportunities. So then again, as a country, Germany is declining to some extent. It is depopulating to some extent. But the real challenge here is manage these huge differences between the two halves of the country. And then, of course, the United States. In the United States, depopulation is typically a problem in rural areas, particularly ones with farming economies. So the upper map shows the purple dots. These are counties in the US. The purple dots are the ones that lost a lot of population between the last two census periods. And as you could see, they are clustering around the American Great Plains. That's the breadbasket of the nation. That's where most of the agricultural production is taking place. The lower map shows the counties in green that are farming dependent, and farming dependent means that they have at least 15% of the population employed in farming or 15% of the local revenues coming from farming. And 15% is a lot in the US right now because agriculture is largely mechanized and consolidated. It does not need a whole lot of people to work in. So as you could see, the two patterns match up really nicely. So the places that are typically declining in the US are the ones with dominant economies in agriculture. All right, so once we put these three countries together and add Japan, then we could think about a few interesting things. So first of all, if we take 1950 as 100% of population, you see continuous increase in some countries and then other bumps in others. I would point out that the Japanese trend was very similar to the US until the 1980s. The reason why the US keeps growing, especially from the 1980s, is because of immigration. The 1980s and 1990s were the peak decades of foreign migration to the United States. Without that, the US would have had a very similar pattern than Japan had. And also, I'd like to point out Bulgaria, that's the yellow line. You could see that 4 decades of population increase was eliminated in only 2 decades, which means it is much easier to create depopulation than it is to create population increase. The total fertility rates have been going down. This big bump in the US line, that's the baby boom, the post-war baby boom, super high fertility. And again, the reason why US fertility is around that replacement level because of immigration. Immigration, again, is age selective, with young people coming to the country and they establish their families there. Without these immigrants, particularly those from Latin America, the US fertility rates would be going to the same direction. Of course, because of these trends, natural increase goes down in all of those countries and the median age goes up. Again, the US is an exception in a sense that the large-scale immigration, age-selective immigration, keeps the population younger than average, right? But then the other 2 countries are actually, in terms of median age, are not that different from Japan, interestingly. All right, so what are some of the challenges? Of course, there are the workforce shortage that we know about, problems with Social Security we've heard about in some really excellent talks today, and then, of course, this minor question of who's responsible for covering the increasing costs of Social Security, whether it should be the government or individuals. And also I would point out this part, which is these entrenched social norms and institutions that can be a problem when we try to solve depopulation. We try to react to depopulation, particularly around the family size and structure, and also handling immigration. So when you think about solutions, if we decide that depopulation is a bad thing, then we have to think about the cultural context. We have to think about the social context that is behind depopulation. So it's not always just economics. Sometimes it's a little bit more than that. Oh, wow. This went fast. Okay. So what are some of the local challenges? Well, first of all, think about this as the national economy or the national situation, and this is the local situation. A small wave could change the course of this ship. Not so much for this ship, but then this ship is much more difficult to steer, right? So local economies are a lot more vulnerable to small changes, especially those ones that are monocultural. If they are less diversified, if there is just one type of economy, one type of jobs, then these tend to be very much at risk of a prolonged decline. Now, on the other hand, while municipalities have fewer resources to address these problems, real capital and human capital as well, in many cases, they could be more flexible to find solutions. So for instance, to create a political consensus to do something is much easier in a small place than it is at the national level. So the second type of local challenge comes from what we call place attachment. Place attachment is these subjective, intangible bonds to a location or a community. The reasons why we love places, or the reasons why we hate places and move away from those. These are strictly based on individual preferences. Now, place attachment works both ways. If place attachment is strong, it can help the local economy it gives the local economy some more flexibility to deal with recessions. However, if place attachment is weak, it can erode communities without any economic trouble. Which means that if people suddenly decide that I don't like where I live and I'm going to move to someplace else, then no great economy would change that. And to some extent, that's part of the reason behind the large-scale rural to urban migration in the 20th century around the globe. So, of course, place attachment varies in the life course. Young people move for different reasons than old people move. So you have to think about, when you think about, I need to increase place attachment, well, increase place attachment for whom? Which is the target population group. And again, this is the extreme form of place attachment. This is a place with the population of one. And that person is that population. And it really shows that somebody is really very much connected to the place. Of course, in that place, replacement may be a problem. Okay, so I'm going to give you two examples from Kansas. One is Finney County with a one-sided economy that's meat packing. It's in southwest Kansas. And as you could see in the 1980s and the 1990s, age-specific migration rates showed a large influx of young migrants, young workers to that community. Most of them are from Mexico. In the 2000s, however, those migration trends turned entirely negative for all ages. The reason for this was very simple. The reason for this was very simple. There was a plant fire in the Christmas in 2000, and that fire took down the largest meatpacking plant in the place. And the company decided not to rebuild that plant, but to move the workers to other places. Since this particular county had no other economy, significant economy, but meatpacking, that one single freak event turned the county's population dynamics completely around. So that's that's no diversification. There is only plan A, and that's it, and there is nothing else. The other example is Greensburg, Kansas, which experienced a tornado in 2007 that leveled most of the town. This is how Greensburg looked like after the tornado. After that, the town was rebuilt as a green town. So they thought they could capitalize on the name and then turn this into an environmental friendly town. And the question, of course, whether that did the trick. Now, as we could see, not so much. This is the Greensburg population between 2000 and 2013. You could see a declining trend. This is the impact of the tornado a couple of years after the tornado, because it took some time for the official statistics to reflect that population change. So as you could see, the impact of the tornado, but after the tornado, the town's population did not reverse at all. And it did not decline too much, but it also means that the tornado was just a small thing that accelerated the same trend. And it's particularly true when you think about the town's population compared to the county's population. So up to the 1970s, the county population declined, but Greensburg was able to capitalize on that, sort of like absorbing a large number of people who moved from the rural hinterland to the central town of the county, which was Greensburg. Once you exhausted that reserve pool, then the county's population went down the same way. So it's a natural catastrophe, which is very unfortunate, but again, reinventing the town as a green town did not have the desired impact on the place. Okay, so how we can address depopulation? Governments usually have two choices: either deal with, do something about fertility, that is, try to boost fertility, or do something about immigration. Those are the two typical reactions to depopulation, each with its own challenges. In the European Union, local depopulation is being addressed by specific development policies that try to promote a positive image of the countryside. It's really important because they try to play the identity game. They try to make people associate positively with rural landscapes and rural places, mostly through tourism, and that's extremely expensive because you need to have a lot of money to channel from central resources to those places. The US responses are very different. Their response to depopulation is not do anything. Let the towns and the places figure out what they can do, build on their local amenities, build on their own resources. It is great in a sense that it does not remove money from places like what the EU system does, but it also doesn't redistribute a whole lot of resources either. So in conclusion, we could see a couple of things. The global demographic trend is fertility decline, not just in Japan, but anywhere else, and aging as well. But especially if you think about local levels, it is increasingly important to identify migration triggers. It's all about migration, right? That's going to drive demographic dynamics. So is demography destiny? Maybe at the local level, if you have a plant fire, such as in Finney County, then that is going to, destroy the place demographically speaking. But at the national level, there is always time to identify problems. Demography does not happen overnight, right? Especially, again, at the national level. So demographic trends are fairly easy to predict to a couple of decades, so people should be able to see the problems, and they should have enough time to try to find solutions to that, realistically. Now, Japan is not in a fundamentally unique situation. It may be the most aging country in the world. It may be the country with the highest life expectancy. But many of the problems and challenges Japan is facing, demographically speaking, actually is happening elsewhere. So you could look into other countries' solutions, how to think about those problems and how to tackle them. Of course, the difficulty for Japan is managing this short-term challenge, which is the aging workforce, and then work on something that's a long-term solution, which of course comes from fertility. So that should be the long-term goal. Try to come up with a fertility reversal policy. That's very difficult because you have to address the work-life balance. If you require women to have a large number of kids, well, you cannot require them to work all the time either. So you just can't do those two things at the same time. And also you have to be able to challenge the social norms on childbearing, which is a very difficult thing to do. At the same time, try to manage immigration as a short-term fix. Immigration covers many, many things. So it's not like a country has to suddenly embrace 10 million Hungarians moving in, right? So guest worker programs could have a short-term impact and trying to free up labor reserves to deal with the fertility reversal policy. And then finally, it is very important, as others have said today, to try to increase local capacity. One size never fits all. One central governmental solution will not work for everybody. So the most important thing is to provide resources to municipalities so that they could do the work. They know those places the best, right? Now this is of course very challenging, but as you say it, you can stumble 7 times as long as you get up 8 times. So let me finish with this one. And I apologize if I got the characters wrong. I meant to say, thank you very much. But let me sort of like finish up with this picture. This is the Hungarian Great Plains, a very much depopulating area. This is part of my family comes from. It's a beautiful landscape, and it has become part of this identity in European rural development that hopefully will help people moving back there. Thank you very much.
クルチャー先生、ありがとうございました。